In an elegant chateau shadowed by secrets, a proud and cynical prince tests the honesty of a newly hired cleaning maid, leaving a coffer filled with riches temptingly open. Yet her unexpected dignity and silent strength disrupt his carefully calculated game, unraveling hidden intrigues that threaten to destroy everything he thought secure. Amid accusations and betrayals, a forbidden bond emerges, proving the most valuable truths are often found not in gold, but within a heart that refuses to be bought. The drizzle came down in a soft mist, turning the gravel path to damp slate beneath Elise's boots as she stepped down from the narrow carriage. The iron gates loomed ahead, high and blackened with age, their pointed arches half-veiled by ivy and fog. Somewhere behind them, past the winding drive, stood the Château d'Aramis, cold, ancient, and steeped in the sort of silence that made every sound feel like a trespass. Elise stood very still for a moment, both hands gripping the worn leather handle of her traveling satchel. Its weight was pitiful, holding only a change of underclothes, a plain comb, and a folded scrap of paper with the chateau's address written in hurried script. A muffled creak pulled her gaze upward. The gate had begun to open, slowly and without ceremony, pushed by a footman in a long, wet overcoat who kept his eyes lowered and said nothing. She followed him without question. The path stretched ahead between rows of tall, trimmed hedges, their leaves slick and shining in the dull morning light. The chateau rose at the end like a vision from another century, its pale limestone facade nearly blending into the bleached sky. The windows were long and narrow, some still shuttered, all expressionless. There were no bird song, no rustling branches, no sign of welcome. Only the sound of Elise's boots on wet stone and the distant roll of wheels as the carriage pulled away behind her. At the rear of the property, the tone shifted. The grandeur gave way to quiet order. Stone courtyards, kitchen gardens, sheds neatly tucked into the slope of the land. The footman led her to a smaller door set into the chateau's side, then handed her off to a matronly woman who introduced herself with nothing more than a name and a glance. "Madame Rougier," she said. Her voice was firm, her manner brisk, her gaze appraising. "You'll refer to me as Madame at all times." Elise nodded once. She did not smile. The woman led her through a narrow hall, past a row of shelves filled with linens and copper pails, to a cramped chamber at the edge of the servants' wing. The room smelled of lye and cold stone, and its only furnishings were a narrow cot, a cracked wash basin, and a wooden trunk with no key. "You will rise at 5, dress plainly, speak only when spoken to, and perform your duties without delay," Madame Rougier continued, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. "You will clean the grand hall, the gallery, the east drawing room, and the lower fireplaces each morning before breakfast. No questions, no mistakes. Discretion is a virtue." Elise remained motionless, her posture perfectly straight despite the chill in the room. She kept her eyes a breath below Madame Rougier's face, not submissive, but controlled, as though she knew exactly what was expected of her and had no intention of offering more. "If you last a week," Madame added, "you may be considered for additional tasks." That was the end of the welcome. The door shut behind her with a finality that echoed against the stone walls. By the afternoon, Elise had been absorbed into the quiet machinery of the household. The staff paid her little attention. She was another face in a uniform of washed-out gray and white, another pair of hands to carry the soot bucket, to scrub the tiled corridor on her knees, to polish the smudged brass handles lining the grand staircase. None asked her name. Some looked at her with mild curiosity when they passed, as if noting a new object on a shelf. But for the most part, she was invisible. She didn't mind. The silence was familiar, even preferable. She worked without complaint, without hesitation. Her hands moved quickly and efficiently, and she never once paused to admire the luxury around her, though the chateau was full of it. Gilded mirrors hung in pairs down the corridor like solemn sentinels. Velvet curtains framed the tall windows in heavy pleated folds. Oil portraits lined the walls, each subject painted with grave dignity, their eyes following one's movements like whispers. She passed them all without a flicker of expression. It wasn't until near dusk that Elise was asked to assist with the drawing rooms on the west side, where a trail of muddy prints had marred the patterned carpet. One of the senior maids, brisk and thin-lipped, handed her a brush and cloth and gestured down the corridor. "The Salon Bleu. Don't take long." She went without protest, her bucket in one hand, her cloth slung over the other. The salon was unfamiliar to her, yet as she approached it, something about the stillness of that hall, the quality of its silence, caused her pace to slow. The salon door was partially open. Elise stepped inside. At first, she thought the room was unused. Dust clung to the drapes like a thin layer of frost. The furniture was covered in white cloths that dulled the outlines of settees, chairs, and a harpsichord half buried beneath time. The light that filtered through the tall windows was watery, almost metallic, casting everything in a grey sheen. Her footsteps were hushed by the thick carpet. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for the source of the dirt she had been sent to clean. It was then that she saw it. Near the far wall, just beneath the tall window and beside an old writing desk, sat a wooden coffer. Its lid was open. The coffer was not grand. Its edges were worn smooth by age, the iron hinges slightly tarnished. But the contents within made Elise stop mid-step. Bundles of notes lay stacked in tight rolls, secured with ribbon. Beneath them, coins glimmered faintly in the low light, rows of them, neat and deliberate, as though someone had taken care to display their arrangement. There were gold francs, silver écus, even a few older coins marked with the crests of now-defunct provinces. It was not just a coffer, it was a declaration. Elise's breath caught, but she did not move forward. She looked once around the room. No one. The air was still, but not quiet. It pressed against her like a held breath, as if the walls themselves waited to see what she would do. She took one slow step forward, not toward the coffer, but toward the table beside it. A smear of dust marred the edge. Without hesitation, she drew a cloth from her apron and wiped it clean, folding the linen neatly afterward and tucking it away. Her eyes did not linger on the gold. She gave it no second glance. Instead, she turned back toward the doorway, pausing only to look around one last time, confirming what she already believed, that she had been sent here not to clean, but to be seen. Yet no one stood behind her. She crossed the room again, her steps measured, and knelt near the fireplace to begin the task she had been given. The coffer remained untouched, gleaming quietly beneath the window like a waiting question. Still, she kept her back to it, her hand steady as she scrubbed away the faint trace of soot from the hearth. And then, behind her, a floorboard creaked. She was not alone. The sound was slight, just a shift in weight across a plank worn thin by time, but in the hush of the blue salon it rang with the clarity of a dropped coin. Elise's breath caught at once. She did not turn. The sensation was immediate, unmistakable. Someone was watching her. She could feel it in the space behind her shoulder blades, in the way the air seemed to change texture, heavier, suddenly more aware of itself. There was no voice, no greeting, no footfall. Only the silence of someone holding themselves perfectly still. Her hand, still gripping the cloth she had used to wipe the hearth, began to ache from the tension in her fingers. Slowly, as if she moved through water, she placed the cloth back into her apron. Her thoughts spun quietly but with sharp precision. She had not heard the door open. Whoever was behind her had been there for longer than a moment. Still kneeling, she smoothed her skirt and stood with deliberate calm. The coffer remained where it was, open and gleaming faintly in the dimming light. She did not look at it again. Instead, she turned her head slightly and then fully, her gaze traveling across the room. He stood at the threshold. A man, tall, motionless, half hidden by the shadows cast from the open door. The fading daylight from the corridor struck the edge of his face, revealing a strong jaw and the glint of pale eyes that seemed to study her without blinking. He did not speak, nor did she. But the stillness between them was charged, like the moment before a match is struck. Elise kept her expression composed, but every muscle beneath her skin had tensed. She had never seen him before, not up close, but she knew exactly who he was. The dark coat of fine cut, the polished boots that had not walked through any servant's corridor, the quiet, expectant posture of someone used to being answered. He needed no introduction. The prince, Henri d'Aramis. He stepped into the room without haste. His gaze moved past her, straight to the coffer. He let the silence stretch. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "You saw what was in the coffer, didn't you?" Elise felt her heart thump, once, hard. She did not look at the money. She looked at him. There was no challenge in her gaze, only clarity. "Yes," she said, her voice even, soft but not uncertain. He tilted his head slightly, as though the answer had surprised him less than the tone with which it was given. The coffer sat between them like a provocation. He walked past her, slowly, approaching the table where it rested. The soles of his boots made no sound on the thick rug. He stopped just beside the open lid and placed a single gloved finger along the edge, trailing it absently. Elise remained where she was, still watching him, still waiting. Henri's expression gave away nothing. He was a man used to commanding a room with silence alone, and his stillness had the weight of habit. But there was something different now, a flicker of interest, not entirely masked behind his control. He looked back at her, and there was something searching in the way his gaze returned to her face. "How long did you stand there?" he asked, "before you decided not to take any?" It was a strange question. Not, "Why didn't you?" but, "How long?" As if the sin had been assumed, and only the delay mattered. Elise answered with a pause. She considered him, the question, the deliberate framing of it. Her shoulders remained square, her hands calm at her sides. "I didn't come here for that," she said quietly. Henri's lips curved faintly, not a smile, closer to something unreadable, a private expression. He looked down again at the money, then closed the lid with a soft click. She felt the sound all the way down her spine. Then he turned away from it and took a step toward her. One, then another. He stopped just a pace away, closer than formality allowed, but not close enough to call it intimacy. His eyes searched hers again, and this time she saw a flicker of something less detached. Curiosity, yes, but also irritation, uncertainty. She had failed his test, or passed it. She couldn't tell which. Henri's voice, when he spoke again, was lower. "Do you know why that was left open?" She remained silent, sensing that no answer she gave would be the correct one. He waited, and when she didn't speak, he nodded once. "Of course you do," he said, more to himself than to her. He turned his back on her then, walked to the window, and looked out over the frost-hardened garden. The sun was beginning to drop lower in the sky, casting long grey shadows across the stone path. In the quiet, Elise could hear the faint hiss of the wind outside the glass panes. She did not move. The moment stretched. Behind them, the door creaked open again. Madame Rougier stepped inside without ceremony. Her face was unreadable, but her tone was brisk. "Your Highness," she said with a slight incline of her head, "you are wanted in the music room. There is a matter regarding the new steward's papers." Henri did not move at first. Then he turned slowly toward the older woman, his face a study in neutrality. He glanced once more at Elise. A flicker of thought crossed his expression, but whatever it was, he chose not to voice it. Instead, he turned and left the room. The door closed softly behind him. Madame Rougier's gaze lingered on Elise for a second longer than necessary. Not suspicious, calculating. Then she too was gone. Elise exhaled slowly. The room was quiet again, but the silence had changed. She returned to her task without a word. Her hands resumed the careful work of dusting, scrubbing, restoring order. But there was a tension beneath the movement that had not been there before, The air felt different on her skin, as though something invisible had been touched and awakened. It was not until she bent to retrieve the cloth again from the floor that she realized her hand was trembling. She didn't know why, and yet she did. The sun dipped lower, bathing the corners of the salon in a pale golden wash that made everything, every shadow, every breath, feel sharper. And as she turned toward the corridor, she crossed her fingers beneath the folds of her apron, so briefly and quietly that even she wasn't certain why she did it. A silent gesture, a secret tether. She had touched something in that room that did not belong to her. And it was not the coffer. A single voice echoed behind her in the corridor, low, female, unmistakably sharp. She saw the money. Of course she saw it. But did you see her hands after? The remark floated through the corridor like a gust through an open door, sharp, fleeting, yet impossible to ignore. Elise paused mid-step, her body tightening instinctively as her ears strained to catch more. But there was nothing. Only the faint hum of voices diminishing around the bend, swallowed by the cavernous hush of the château. The words might not have been meant for her, or they might have been meant precisely for her. She walked on. The light had shifted again. Outside the tall windows, the sky had dipped into that uncertain shade between grey and blue, signaling the slow extinguishing of the day. Gas sconces had not yet been lit, and in the corridors, dust motes floated in streaks of gold like ash suspended in still air. By the time Elise returned her bucket and cloths to the scullery, the kitchens were bustling with early preparations for the evening supper. No one looked up at her, but she felt their awareness of her all the same. The sideways glances, the abrupt silences as she passed. She had been invisible that morning. Now she was something else, something that whispered and lingered even after she left a room. She didn't ask why. She knew. The encounter in the blue salon, whatever it had been, had not stayed in that room. Word traveled without sound in places like this, curling through walls like smoke. She washed her hands carefully at the basin, scrubbing until the raw scent of lye overtook the perfume of polished wood and warm bread that hung in the air. The skin of her palms stung, but she welcomed the bite. It grounded her. She didn't want softness just now. She finished her chores without complaint, without error, and without looking anyone too directly in the eye. As the light faded fully, she was sent with another maid to carry up fresh linens to the guest rooms. The girl beside her, a redhead with quick steps and quicker glances, spoke only once as they climbed the service stairs. "You were with him, in the salon." It was not a question. Elise said nothing. The girl gave a small, unreadable snort and turned away, continuing the ascent in silence. They worked quickly. The linen closets had been arranged with obsessive order, each shelf stacked with precise symmetry. The weight of expectation in the chateau pressed as heavily on the second floor as it did below. When their tasks were finished, the other girl disappeared down the hall with a tight nod. Elise remained in the corridor for a breath longer than necessary. Through the tall, narrow window at the end of the hall, the last orange flame of sunset bled across the horizon. The trees stood like blackened statues against the firelit sky. It was beautiful, in a way that made the ribs beneath her stays ache. She turned and descended, just as the dinner bell rang below. The lower halls were again alive with motion. Servants moved like shadows, efficient, silent, with hands full of silver and dishes and steaming porcelain pots. Elise slipped past them and returned to her quarters, where she found the small cot undisturbed, her bag untouched. She sat for a long moment on the edge of the mattress, her fingers pressed to her lips. His voice echoed again in her mind. "You saw what was in the coffer, didn't you? Not a rebuke. A measurement." She still didn't know what he had expected her to do, but something in his face, in the way his gaze lingered too long, told her he had not gotten what he wanted. Or perhaps worse, he had. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Madame Rougier entered without waiting for permission. She did not sit. "The prince has left for the evening? A matter in the village?" Her eyes didn't blink. You will tend to the downstairs gallery in his absence. Immediately. Elise stood without comment. Rougier's gaze lowered, just slightly, to her hands. Then she turned and walked out as if the matter were already finished. Elise took up her apron again, fastening the ties with a firm pull. She went downstairs and crossed the echoing main corridor to the gallery, where she worked beneath the looming oil portraits and chandeliers that looked down like gods from another age. The quiet was welcome, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being seen. She finished her duties before the hour struck 8, then returned to the scullery to wash her hands a second time. The sting of the soap was no less sharp. The fire had been banked, the coals red and quiet in the stove. Around her, the clink of dishes and soft footfalls began to dwindle. The long day was drawing to its close. Then a sharp voice cut through the hush. "You there?" She turned. It was one of the footmen, older, with greying hair and eyes that did not smile. He held out a folded scrap of paper, the edges marked with soot. "Deliver this to the upstairs maid on the west side." Elise took it silently, nodding once, then left through the corridor without reading it. But before she reached the stair, a soft murmur to her left caught her attention. Two maids bent over the basin in the outer hall, whispering. She was in the salon with him, and afterward? He didn't say a word, just walked out like the air had been knocked from him. She didn't even look at the money, that's what Marianne said. No one does that. Not unless they know he's watching. Their voices trailed off as Elise passed, head high, hands steady. She didn't slow until she reached the western hall. There, in the empty corridor, beneath the flickering gas lamp, she allowed herself one brief pause. The folded note burned in her hand. She had delivered many things in her life. But tonight, the weight of this one felt different, as if it held something that had not yet been spoken aloud. She knocked once, lightly, on the door. The maid opened it, took the note with a distracted nod, and closed the door again. Elise turned back toward the stair, and stopped. Henri Daramitz stood at the far end of the corridor. She hadn't heard him approach. He wasn't wearing his coat, just a dark waistcoat, his collar slightly loosened, as if he'd returned in haste. His hair was damp from the evening mist, but it was his expression that made her throat tighten. He wasn't looking at her with suspicion. He was looking at her as though she had become a question he could no longer answer. He walked forward, not quickly, but with purpose. The hall around them was utterly quiet, the flames of the sconces throwing moving shadows against the walls. When he reached her, he stopped a step away, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of rain and wool on his coat. She waited. He did not speak. Instead, without preamble, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, wrapped in a folded cloth. He held it out to her. She stared at it for a moment before lifting her hand to take it. The linen was warm from his body. Inside, something metallic shifted against her fingers, but she didn't unwrap it. She looked up at him. His gaze did not waver. Then a sharp knock echoed down the corridor. Both turned toward the sound. Madame Rougier stood at the top of the servants' stair, her face pale, her voice rigid. "The steward has reported a theft. The old coffer in the blue salon has vanished." She stepped forward, eyes pinned on Elise. "And someone claims they saw you leaving with it." The words fell like cold iron into the corridor. Elise stood motionless, the folded linen still in her hands, as the air between her and Madame Rougier turned sharp and thin. The stone walls, once silent, seemed suddenly to hold breath. A theft, the coffer. The accusation hung, complete and immediate, with no room for defense and no offer of explanation. Henri didn't move either. His posture remained composed, but the shift in his eyes, swift and narrowing, betrayed a flicker of surprise. Not confusion. He knew at once that the accusation was deliberate, that it came too quickly, too neatly. Elise felt a single drop of sweat trail down her spine beneath the weight of her dress. Her fingers tightened around the linen, pressing the edges into her palm. She hadn't spoken yet. Not because she was at a loss, but because the very precision of the moment demanded silence. Any word might shatter it. Any movement might confirm it. Madame Rougier descended one step, then another, her heels clicking against the stone. Her face remained calm, but there was a severity in the lines of her mouth, the way her gaze flicked briefly to the linen bundle in Elise's hands before snapping back to her face. "You were seen," Rougier repeated. "Not long after you were asked to clean the salon. You were alone. You remained longer than necessary." Henri's voice, when it came, was low. "By whom?" Rougier didn't answer right away. Her glance toward him was measured. "A housemaid," she said. "She will speak if required. For now, the matter concerns the security of the household." Elise finally looked directly at her, not pleading, not shrinking, just looking. "I did not take it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Madame Rougier's expression did not change. "Then you will have no objection to remaining confined until the matter is clarified." It wasn't a suggestion. Henri spoke again, more forcefully. "That won't be necessary." Rougier turned her eyes on him with something close to defiance, but cloaked, still, in formality. "With respect, Your Highness, this is a matter of property missing from the château. Until it is recovered, those who were last seen near it must be accounted for." He stepped forward. "And what about the others who passed through the salon today? The gallery staff? The steward's boy who delivers the registry?" Rougier did not waver. They were accounted for. Elise was not. The bundle in Elise's hands grew heavier by the second. She said nothing more, knowing that denial would not soften what had already been shaped in the minds around her. Instead, she turned her face slightly toward Henri, allowing herself one moment to see his eyes fully. There was no certainty in them, but there was no judgment either. Only calculation. "I will go," she said, "if that is what must be done." Rougier nodded, as if the outcome had already been determined. She gestured to the footman who had appeared at the bottom of the stair. Word travels fast in a house like this, faster even than reason. He approached Elise with reluctant steps, not touching her, but clearly prepared to escort her. She did not resist. Her steps were quiet as they crossed the corridor. She still held the folded linen. Henri did not stop her, but he did not look away. They brought her to one of the lower rooms near the scullery, a narrow chamber with no windows and a lock on the outside. It smelled of cold stone and old coal. There was no chair, no bedding. Just an empty basin in the corner and a cracked tile floor that had been scrubbed too many times. The footman turned the key behind her, and then she was alone. She did not sit. She stood by the far wall, one hand resting against the uneven surface, and closed her eyes. Not in fear, in thought. The accusation, the timing, the precision. It was no accident. She had been seen by someone, perhaps not taking anything, but present. Long enough to be remembered, long enough to be useful. But it was too soon to know who had spoken, or why. She unwrapped the linen in her hand. Inside was a pendant, small, oval, with a faded miniature painting at its center. A woman's face. Pale, smiling faintly, her hair arranged in the elaborate fashion of the previous generation. There were initials engraved on the gold backplate. It was old, worn, delicate. She ran her finger along its edge. Whatever it was, Henri had not explained it, had only given it to her, as if offering a truth he could not say aloud. She rewrapped it carefully and tucked it beneath the collar of her dress. The hours dragged. There was no sound beyond the shifting of stone and the distant echo of servants' footsteps overhead. The room had no warmth. Time was marked only by the faint change in the light under the door. Then, sometime deep into the night, she heard voices beyond the wall, not loud, muted by distance and stone, but they carried. 2 men, one older, the other young. She won't talk, and if she does, she'll say she never saw it. That's the point. She's too quiet, too clean. A low laugh. That's what makes it believable. Silence, then footsteps again. retreating. Elise did not move. Her heart was hammering now, not with fear, but certainty. She had been placed in the path of something carefully designed. The open coffer, the sudden presence of the prince, the theft, the rumor, and the pendant, now warm against her skin. None of it had happened by chance. The footsteps did not return. No one came to bring her water, or food, or questions. The room remained sealed. She didn't know how much time passed before she heard the whisper of fabric outside the door and the faintest creak of a footstep. Then something else. The sound of a key sliding gently across the floor pushed through the crack beneath the door. She knelt, picked it up, and turned it over in her fingers. It was not the key to the room she had been locked in. It was small, old, and familiar. It matched the coffer. The key was cool and dry against Elise's palm, small enough to disappear entirely within her fingers. She stared at it beneath the dim light that spilled under the door, the bronze catching faint glints of gold with every tremor of her hand. The shape was unmistakable. Rounded at the top, finely cut teeth, worn but still intact. No servant's key, no common lock. She rose to her feet with slow deliberation, closing her fingers around it like someone shielding a flame. Her breath moved in shallow tides as she crossed to the door and pressed her ear to the wood. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement outside. Just the silence of night, undisturbed and treacherous. With her free hand, she reached for the latch, rusted, stiff, and tried it gently. Locked, of course. But the key hadn't come with instructions. Someone had placed it under her door with deliberate care. Not the wrong key, not a distraction, a sign, an invitation. Or perhaps, one last chance to choose which path to take. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door and tried to calm the pulse that now beat at the base of her throat. Her thoughts moved swiftly, but each one returned to the same question. Who had sent it? Who within that silent house had risked being seen to give her a tool that might restore her freedom, or end it altogether? There were no answers, only the key. She waited another minute, listening, watching the gap beneath the door. No shadows passed, no voices. The silence deepened, and with it, her resolve. She crouched, slid the key into her apron pocket, then moved to the narrow slit of high window set in the wall above the wash basin, too small to crawl through. But below that, tucked into the wall, was a vent, square, iron-latticed, and clogged with dust. She pried at it with her fingertips until the grate gave way, revealing the hollow cavity behind the stones, deep enough to reach an arm inside. She tucked the pendant, the one Henri had given her, beneath the collar of her chemise, pressing the cloth flat to hide its shape, and reached into the vent. Nothing, just layers of grit and cold air, no passage, no messages, no other key. She drew her arm back, wiped the dirt from her hand, and returned to the door. The moment stretched. Her fingers curled around the key once more. The lock turned easily, almost too easily, as if it had been used recently. She opened the door with care, barely an inch at a time, until the darkness of the corridor unfolded before her. A single sconce burned low on the far end, its flame reduced to a flickering bead. No footsteps, no watchers. She slipped into the hallway. The air was heavier here, dense with the scent of old coal and iron, dust rising in cold currents from the stone floor. She walked soundlessly, her steps practiced and careful, skimming close to the walls as she made her way through the servants' corridor. Each turn, each stairwell she took with caution, listening first. The silence told her everything. The château had gone to sleep, or pretended to. Either way, she could not afford to linger. At the far end of the north wing, past the outer scullery and the linen yard, she slipped into the passage that led to the disused stables. The air changed as she moved, grew damper, earthy with mildew, and the faint memory of animals long gone. The stables had not been in regular use since the prince had returned from the capital. The horses were now kept in the newer barns nearer the forest road. But this wing had not been demolished. It had simply been abandoned, forgotten, or so it would seem. The stable door stood ajar, one leaning slightly off its hinges. Beyond them, straw blanketed the floor, undisturbed in months. Motes danced in the slant of moonlight filtering through the high windows, and the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of beams contracting in the cold. Elise stepped inside, letting the door fall back into place behind her. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, scanning the familiar space with a gaze sharpened by urgency. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that something waited here. She began moving down the length of the stalls, fingers brushing the wooden doors, eyes searching the corners. The silence followed her, thick as velvet. Then, just past the last stall, she saw it. The floor had been disturbed, not by feet but by movement. The straw was lighter in color, uneven. She knelt and brushed it back. Beneath the straw, pressed into the dirt, was a shallow depression, and at its center, another key. No, not a key, a match. A perfect match. She pulled it free. It was identical to the one she had been given, and with it, half buried in the dirt, a crumpled piece of folded parchment. She opened it slowly. There was no writing, only a pressed wax seal, the same as the one on the coffer. She stared at it, her breath shortening. This wasn't merely evidence. It was the coffer's double. A second key, a second seal. Hidden here, not stolen. The realization settled over her slowly. The coffer hadn't been taken. It had been moved, removed. By someone who had access not only to its location but to its keys, its seal, its authority. She stood, the second key clenched tight in one hand, the seal in the other, and then she heard it. A sound behind her. Footsteps. Not rushed, not hesitant, coming closer. Elise did not turn immediately. The sound of boots on straw was measured, too steady to be accidental, too deliberate to be casual. Each step sank into the floor with just enough pressure to mark intention. Whoever it was, they knew she was there, and they weren't hiding. They expected to be heard. She slid the parchment and seal into the fold of her skirt, fingers curling instinctively around the second key, and rose slowly to her feet. Her breath moved quietly through her nose, careful, calculated. The low rafters above her head creaked once, reacting to a shift in the outside wind, or perhaps to something else. The air inside the old stable was thicker now, the dust disturbed, the space smaller. Another step. She turned. A figure had entered through the side door, an inner one, near the far tack room, not visible from the main courtyard. In the low light, she could make out the fine cut of the coat, the familiar high collar, and the unmistakable poise of someone born into control. Henri. But his expression was not one of triumph or reprimand. It was something closer to disbelief, as if, for all his calculations, he had not expected to find her there. Not like this. Neither of them spoke at first. The distance between them was no more than 10 paces, but the air in that space felt impossibly heavy. She could see how the light from the moon caught at the damp edge of his hair, and how the lines of his mouth were drawn tight, as though bracing against something he couldn't name. He moved one step closer. His gaze shifted to the space behind her, where the straw had been pulled aside, where the seal might still leave a faint mark in the dirt. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, not an accusation, a warning. She didn't reply. Her eyes stayed locked on his. He studied her face, then her hands, and something shifted in his stance, barely noticeable, but real. His hand, which had been resting at his side, curled slightly, as though he meant to reach for something, but didn't. "You found it," he said. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. Henri's jaw worked for a moment before he added, "It was meant to be found later. Not by you." Still, her eyes didn't leave his. "You left the key," she asked finally. No, he said. I didn't. Silence settled again, the kind that didn't ask for filling. She felt the second key in her hand, heavy with implication. Slowly she opened her palm and extended it toward him. He didn't take it. Instead, his gaze dropped to the object, then returned to her face. Where did you find it? He asked. Her voice remained quiet. Under the door. In the servants' corridor. Before I left the cell. Henri stepped forward again, one pace only. The tension in him was no longer restrained. It was pressing at the edges, looking for space. For the first time, his confidence had cracked. No one should have had that key, he said, almost to himself. Elise held out her other hand. And this? She opened her fingers to reveal the sealed parchment, now creased but intact. I found it buried, beneath the straw. Henri reached out then, but not for the parchment. He took the second key from her first hand, turning it between his fingers. There were only two, he said quietly. My father had them made before the revolution, when this estate still answered to higher courts. He gave one to my mother before he left for exile. The other stayed with the steward. He stopped. Elise didn't prompt him. Henri's fingers tightened around the key. The steward's copy was lost when the old estate book was burned, years ago, before I returned. And now it's here, she said. He nodded slowly. Neither of them said what they were thinking, that it had never been lost at all, that it had remained in the hands of someone close, someone who had waited for the right moment. Henri exhaled once, sharply, as if trying to release something he couldn't name. They said you took it, he said. I know. I didn't believe it, he added more quietly. But I also didn't stop it. She looked at him for a long moment. Why not? His answer didn't come quickly. When it did, it was not an answer at all. I've been taught to doubt everything, and to believe nothing unless it benefits the house. He paused. That includes people. She turned her gaze from him then, only briefly, scanning the space around them, the broken stalls, the rotting harnesses that hung like relics from another life. The air smelled of old sweat and leather, and in the moonlight, the dust sparkled like ash suspended mid-fall. You tested me, she said. Yes. Her eyes returned to his. But someone else used your test for something else. His silence was answer enough. She took a slow breath. They wanted me to be the last person near it. They moved it before I could be blamed. They left the key for me to find, knowing it would lead me here, but not for the truth. For the final act. Henri's expression darkened. And what would that act be? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. At that moment, a sharp sound cut through the stillness, the clatter of something metallic against stone. They both turned. At the rear entrance of the stable, the one that led to the outer fields, a figure had just stepped through. The light behind them obscured their face, but the shape, the outline, was unmistakable. Madame Rougier. She did not speak. She raised a lantern, its glow casting her face in stark lines. Behind her, two others entered. One of them held a pistol. Henri stepped in front of Elise without hesitation, but the pistol wasn't pointed at them. It was pointed toward the far wall of the stable, at a fourth figure, half-shadowed, crouching low, trying to slip out the side door. Someone neither of them had seen. Until now. The pistol cocked with a crisp metallic click that shattered the silence like a blade through linen. Henri stepped fully into the line of sight, placing himself between the weapon and Elise without a word. His back was tense, broad shoulders squared, the motion so instinctive it hardly registered as brave. Behind him, Elise's breath caught, but she didn't step back. Her fingers remained curled around the second key, though her focus had already moved past the weapon, to the man crouched near the wall, half obscured by shadows. He was trying to slip through the side exit, but now he stood frozen in place, caught in the widening arc of the lantern's glow. Madame Rougier held the light high, illuminating not just his figure, but the sharp angles of his face, narrow, angular, with dark eyes that flicked between Henri and the pistol leveled at him. He was young, younger than Henri by perhaps a decade, his jacket rumpled and dust-smudged, his boots scuffed as though he had been running or hiding, or both. Henri's voice was steady. "Lower the weapon." The servant holding the pistol, a groom whose name Elise didn't know, didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the man at the wall. Madame Rougier answered instead. "He's the one who took it." The man at the wall glanced once at the pistol, then at Henri, then at Elise. His mouth twisted, not in fear, but in resignation. "I didn't take it," he said, his voice tight. "I was told to move it." Rougier stiffened. "Liar." "I didn't steal it," he repeated, more firmly now. "I was ordered to hide it in the cellar beneath the east wing, 2 nights ago. She gave me the key." He pointed, not to Henri, to Rougier. The moment fractured. Rougier's expression did not shift, but her hand dropped slightly from the lantern, the flame inside trembling against the glass. Henri didn't move. His voice, when it came, was colder. "You're sure of what you're saying?" The young man nodded. "I kept my mouth shut because I was promised 50 francs and a letter of reference. But now she's ready to blame me, or her." He looked at Elise then. She wanted someone else to find the key. "Someone who'd look guilty enough to distract you." Henri's breath was audible in the quiet. His eyes turned to Rougier. "Is this true?" Rougier didn't blink. "He's a fool, and a coward. And yet he remembers exactly where the coffer was hidden," Henri said. Rougier's voice was calm, almost serene. "He's lying because he was caught. He was seen leaving through the servants' corridor after midnight, the same time the coffer went missing." "Then why accuse Elise?" Henri asked. A pause. The lantern shifted again, just slightly. "To protect the house," she said. Elise stepped forward then, her voice cool but unmistakable. "Or to protect yourself." Rougier turned her head slowly. Their eyes met. "I found the second key," Elise said, "and the seal, buried, not lost." The old woman's face showed nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly around the lantern handle. Henri turned toward the groom. "Where is it now?" "The cellar," the boy repeated. "But I don't know if it's still there." "Take me to it," Henri said. "I'm not moving with a pistol pointed at me." Henri stepped to the side and addressed the groom without raising his voice. "Put it down." The young man hesitated, then lowered the weapon, slowly, like a man unsure of his orders. Henri's attention returned to Rougier. "You'll come with us." Rougier gave a faint, unconvincing smile. "Of course." The words echoed thinly in the stable. But as the group began to move toward the door, Elise lingered. Something about the moment itched at the back of her mind, something that didn't fit. Rougier wasn't a woman who made mistakes. And this one, leaving behind a key, trusting a servant, faking a theft so sloppily. This wasn't her way. She watched the old woman's face in profile. Calm. Almost too calm. They moved as a group through the rear corridor that connected the stables to the older part of the château. The air grew colder, the stones damp beneath their feet. No one spoke. The only sound was the hollow rhythm of boots on stone. They descended into the cellar beneath the east wing, once used for coal, now empty save for forgotten crates and a scattering of cobwebs. The groom led them to a narrow alcove at the far end, where a slanted board had been pushed aside to reveal a hollow space beneath the floor. He dropped to his knees, reached into the dark gap, and pulled something forward. A wooden coffer, covered in dust, identical to the one in the blue salon. Henri stepped forward and brushed the surface with his sleeve. The seal was intact. The hinges matched. He opened it. Inside, the money remained untouched. Bundled notes, rolled coins, even a few ledgers tucked in the side compartment. Henri stared at it for a long moment. Then he straightened and looked back at Rougier. Still, she said nothing. Elise's gaze didn't leave her. Henri shut the lid gently. The sound echoed off the stone walls. "Why?" he asked. The silence held. And then Rougier exhaled. "I served your father," she said. "I watched this house fall into chaos after the war. I saw creditors knocking. I saw staff unpaid. I saw your mother weep because there was nothing left. So when the money began to return, when the lands recovered, I took what I could. Slowly. Carefully." Henri's eyes did not move. Rougier's voice remained even. It was never for greed. It was for control. The house was vulnerable, too many eyes watching, too many voices whispering, so I silenced them, one by one. "And Elise?" he asked. "She came with no ties, no protector. She was perfect." Rougier turned toward Elise then, as though they were alone. "You carried yourself like someone who expected nothing. That kind of dignity is dangerous. It invites curiosity." The groom looked away. The pistol now hung loose in his grip. Henri said nothing. And for a moment it seemed Rougier might go quietly. But then her hand moved, a quick flick toward her coat, a glint of steel. Henri lunged forward, grabbing her wrist before the blade could clear her sleeve. The lantern crashed to the ground, shattering in a burst of flame and glass. The groom leapt back. The pistol clattered from his hand. The room erupted into chaos as the fire licked across the spilled oil. Smoke billowed. Shadows danced wildly on the walls. Elise stepped back from the heat, coughing, her eyes streaming. The old crates ignited in seconds, the dry wood hissing and cracking. Henri dragged Rougier away from the spreading fire, her resistance weak now, the knife clattering to the floor. The groom kicked it aside. The coffer sat behind them, half illuminated, flames reflecting off its polished edge. They had only seconds. Henri turned to Elise, his voice sharp through the smoke. "The key. Give it to me." But before she could answer, a sound rose behind them, a sound that didn't belong to the fire. Footsteps, coming fast, from the tunnel. The footsteps came fast, heavier than a servant's, deliberate as a soldier's, pounding through the narrow stone corridor that led into the cellar. The walls carried the sound ahead of the figure itself, a rhythm like the heartbeat of the château, sudden and irregular with the force of urgency. Henri turned sharply toward the tunnel mouth, the broken lantern's flame still clawing at the edges of the room. Smoke thickened in ragged spirals, curling through the beams, stinging their eyes. Behind him, the coffer remained half buried in its hollow, firelight dancing over its carved edges like a secret about to be consumed. Elise stepped back instinctively, her sleeve pressed over her mouth, eyes searching through the smoke as her lungs tightened. She could taste ash, old wood, something sharper, oil igniting from the shattered glass. A coughing fit tore from her throat, but she did not look away from the tunnel. From the corner of her vision she saw Henri shift his stance, his frame taut with readiness, not fear, but calculation. He was unarmed, his coat singed at the shoulder where it had brushed the flaming crates, but still, he stood between her and the advancing threat, as he had in the stable. And then the figure emerged. It was not another servant, not a guard. It was the steward. Gaspard, they had called him, though Elise had never heard him speak a full sentence. Quiet, diligent, the sort of man whose face disappeared in a crowd, but not now. Now he was flushed, hair damp with sweat, his usually crisp waistcoat unbuttoned, sleeves pushed up to the elbows. There was something clutched in his hand, a bundle wrapped hastily in dark fabric. His eyes scanned the room wildly before fixing on the coffer. Then, with sudden purpose, he moved forward. Henri blocked his path. "Step back," Gaspard said, his voice ragged. "That belongs to the house." Henri didn't budge. "So it does. It has to be moved." The steward's tone broke, desperation fracturing its surface. "The fire, if it spreads, the east wing." Henri looked at him, unblinking. "You were running toward it." The steward faltered. The bundle in his hand slipped slightly open, revealing the corner of a ledger. Henri saw it. "So it's not the coffer you came for." His voice had turned quiet. "It's the record. I have to protect what I can," Gaspard said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Everything is falling apart. He gestured toward Rougier, who now slumped against a crate, breathing in shallow rasps. "She was supposed to. She used you," Elise said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "As she used everyone else." Gaspard's eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment something like shame crossed his face. He looked smaller now, bent, exhausted, as if the weight of too many secrets had hollowed him from the inside. But his grip on the ledger didn't loosen. "I know what's in this," he said. "Years of transactions, names, payments. If it burns, nothing can be proven." "Then give it to me," Henri said. "No." A gust of flame erupted behind them, fed by a new crack in the crate. The fire was growing fast, eating through dry wood and splintered beams. The heat pressed in around them, sucking the air thin. Henri lunged. Gaspard tried to turn, but the prince was faster. In a swift motion, Henri grabbed his arm and wrenched the bundle from his grasp. The ledger tumbled to the ground, pages curling as smoke licked its edges. Elise rushed forward, stamping out the small burst of flame with her boot. The paper was scorched, but not lost. Henri shoved Gaspard back. The steward staggered, landing hard against the wall. "You're done," Henri said. His voice was quiet, final. A loud crack snapped above them. The ceiling groaned, and a beam sagged under the weight of heat and time. "We have to go," Elise said. She clutched the ledger to her chest, the key still tucked in her skirt. "Now." The smoke grew heavier. Flames leapt across the ceiling. Henri turned to the groom. "Get her out." But the boy had already vanished, gone in the panic, taking his own route out. Elise coughed again, her lungs beginning to burn. Henri grabbed the coffer with one arm, lifted it with effort, and nodded toward the tunnel. "Go," he said. "Don't wait." She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then turned and ran. Her skirts caught against the jagged stones as she climbed. The ledger pressed tight against her side. Behind her, Henri followed, the coffer weighing him down, but his steps steady. They reached the upper corridor as the fire roared behind them, the heat trailing like breath on their heels. At the landing, Elise turned back. Henri staggered at the top of the stairs, and for one terrifying moment she thought he would fall. But then he caught himself, shouldered the coffer again, and met her eyes. Together, they moved through the service hallway, smoke curling behind them like a ghost unwilling to release its hold. The first blast of clean air hit her face as she pushed through the kitchen door and into the courtyard beyond. Night had deepened, the sky smeared with stars, the wind sharp and cold. Henri emerged seconds later, his coat singed, hair damp, soot streaking his face. They stood in the gravel, breathing hard, the fire's glow rising behind the east wing like a second dawn. The coffer thudded as Henri dropped it onto the stone step. The ledger remained tight in Elise's grasp. In the distance, alarm bells began to ring. Servants stirred, doors opened, voices rose in confusion, but she barely heard them. Because someone else was running now. Not from the fire, but toward them. The pounding of boots across gravel broke the stillness like a warning bell. Elise turned her head sharply, the wind snapping her skirts around her ankles. Henri's posture shifted beside her, his body angling slightly toward her, as if by instinct, protective. But the man running toward them bore no weapon, no uniform. His face, flushed and streaked with soot, was unmistakable. The young groom. He stumbled to a halt a few paces from them, chest heaving, eyes wild. "There's no one left inside," he said between gasps. "They've all come out. Some went to the village for help. The flames are spreading to the upper beams, but the rest of the chateau is still safe. For now." Henri gave a single, curt nod, his breathing still uneven from the weight of the coffer he had carried. "Find the steward, Gaspard. Make certain he doesn't leave the grounds." The boy hesitated, then nodded, and ran again, disappearing into the confusion. Around them, the château stirred like a living creature waking from troubled sleep. Bells rang out from the west tower, sharp and uneven, not alarm bells but the signal to rouse the household. Windows glowed with candlelight. Servants rushed across the inner court in nightclothes and shawls, clutching lanterns and shouting to one another. No one approached Henri. No one dared. But they watched him, watched Elise too, smeared with ash, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, clutching a scorched ledger to her chest. She hadn't let go of it, not once. And Henri noticed. He turned toward her now, and something in his face, something deeper than gratitude, quieted the air between them. "You saved it," he said simply. Elise looked down at the bundle in her arms. The pages were curled, the cover blistered, but the seal was intact. She held it out to him. "It belongs to you," she said. But Henri did not take it. He glanced down at the coffer resting at their feet, then back at her. "No," he said softly. "It belongs to the house, but only the truth can restore it." He reached forward then, not for the ledger, but for her hand. His fingers were soot-streaked and warm, closing over hers with a deliberate pressure. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Behind them, the glow of the east wing brightened as another beam gave way with a terrible crack. Sparks leapt into the wind, spinning high above the rooftops like fireflies. Henri released her hand then and bent to lift the coffer once more. "Come," he said. "The rest must be done in daylight." Elise followed him across the courtyard, past the watching faces of the staff, through the high doors of the main hall. The grand entrance had been opened to allow the flow of air and of people, and for the first time since her arrival, Elise crossed its threshold without restriction. The inside of the château smelled of smoke and damp stone. But the heat of the fire had not reached this far. The walls remained cool to the touch. The grand staircase loomed above them, shadowed and silent, the flickering candlelight not enough to dispel the echoes of what had just unfolded. Henri did not pause. He carried the coffer into the drawing room on the west side, a stately space with velvet chairs, high windows, and a marble hearth untouched by soot. The groom who had returned with the news of the fire now followed them in, still panting. "Gaspar is locked in the steward's quarters," he said. "2 guards are posted outside. Madame Rougier is being watched in the kitchen. She's injured, but not badly." Henri inclined his head. "Stay near the door. Admit no one." The boy nodded and stepped back into the corridor, closing the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Henri placed the coffer on the low table and unlatched its clasps. He opened it slowly, revealing the neatly stacked contents, untouched, preserved. He ran his hand lightly over the coins, the ribboned bundles of notes, and the old leather pouch tucked beside them. His expression was unreadable. Elise stood by the hearth, her arms folded now, the ledger resting against the back of a velvet chair. She didn't speak. She watched. Henri straightened and turned toward her. His face was drawn, not with fatigue, but with realization. A dismantling of something long held. "This," he said, glancing down at the contents, "was never about the money." Elise tilted her head slightly, waiting. He gestured to the coffer. Rougier hoarded it. Gaspar concealed it. But neither of them took it for wealth. They took it for control. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Power lives in silence, Elise. In secrets. In people who are too afraid to question what they're told. For years, I thought this house could be governed with distance and discipline. But it rotted underneath me." She didn't reply. Her quiet was not passive. It was understanding. Henri moved toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. "You were never meant to pass my test." "I know," she said. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the weight of everything they had just come through lingering between them like smoke that wouldn't lift. "And yet," he said, "you did." Their eyes held. No more words came. None were needed. Somewhere beyond the walls, the fire hissed low, losing strength. A clock began to chime. 5 bells. Morning. The door opened behind them. A footman entered quietly, pausing at the sight of the prince and the soot-smeared woman beside him. He bowed. "Messieurs from the magistrate's office are on their way," he said. "A carriage was sent at dawn." Henri nodded once. "Prepare the east gallery for their arrival, and have the steward brought to the front hall. He will give testimony." The servant withdrew, leaving the door ajar. Elise crossed the room slowly, placing the ledger beside the coffer. The two sat side by side, evidence not only of theft, but of the system that had allowed it. She looked back at Henri. "What happens now?" she asked. His voice was quiet. "Everything changes." He crossed to the window, pulling the heavy curtain aside. Pale morning light spilled into the room, chasing the shadows across the carpet. The sky was clear now. No smoke. Only the gold-tinged edge of dawn breaking across the vineyards beyond the chateau walls. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable, but no longer cold. "There will be hearings, questions, the estate will be audited, and He paused. "I will answer for what I allowed to go unseen." Elise met his gaze. "You didn't see because no one challenged you to look." Henri gave a quiet, rueful smile. "Until you." They stood there, in the soft morning light, with the scent of ash still lingering, and the heat of the night not yet gone from their skin. The silence that settled was not heavy. It was full. Outside, the clatter of horses announced the approach of the magistrate's carriage. Inside, the house began, slowly, to breathe again. The magistrate's carriage arrived just after sunrise, its wheels grinding softly over the gravel drive, the crest of the prefecture embossed in worn gold on the side. A quiet hush fell over the château as the vehicle rolled to a stop beneath the front portico. No fanfare, no display. Just the opening of a door, the heavy fall of boots on stone, and the chill of authority entering a place that had, for too long, governed itself. Inside the grand vestibule, the staff stood in quiet lines. Some still bore the smudges of smoke, others the pallor of a sleepless night. But all had been summoned, by order of the prince himself, to witness what would follow. No more silence. No more shadows. Elise stood near the base of the staircase, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her apron pressed and clean. She had changed in the early hours, not to disguise the night's events, but to meet what came next with the same dignity she had carried through every hour of her labor. Her hair, swept back, bore no ornament. Her eyes were calm. Henri waited near the coffer, which had been placed at the foot of the great hall for examination. The ledger rested beside it, the ribbon still tied but smoke-stained. When the magistrate stepped forward, a tall man with silver at his temples and the posture of someone long accustomed to power, Henri bowed his head, but did not lower his gaze. Words passed between them. Formalities first, then the matter at hand. The steward was brought forward, pale and sweating, his cravat askew, his eyes darting to Rougier, who sat in a high-backed chair to the side, her wrist bound in a linen wrap, her face as unreadable as stone. There was no argument now, no pretense. Testimonies were taken. The groom, shaking but steady, told what he had seen. The key, the orders, the coffer moved under direction. Gaspard, when pressed, confessed to his role, his complicity, his silence in exchange for favor. The magistrate listened without interruption, his pen moving in quiet strokes across the parchment. When he turned his eyes to Madame Rougier, she did not deny what had been said. She looked not at the magistrate, nor at Henri, but at the tapestry on the far wall, depicting a stag brought to its knees by a ring of hounds. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said. "I preserved this house. I kept its walls from collapse." "You nearly burned it down," the magistrate replied evenly. Her shoulders sagged slightly, but her eyes did not dim. When Henri was called to speak, he stood with his hands behind his back, his voice clear and low. "I trusted those around me to act with integrity. I believed that loyalty meant righteousness. I allowed that belief to blind me to the rot beneath my feet. There was a pause. No one spoke. Henri looked toward Elise. And if not for her, I would still be blind. The magistrate turned to her then. "You are not a member of the household staff any longer, mademoiselle." The words hung in the air. Elise lifted her chin. "I know. You acted with independence, with initiative. You disobeyed orders, escaped confinement, and interfered with a matter of house security." "Yes." The magistrate nodded once. "And in doing so, preserved both property and record. We will not forget that." She inclined her head slightly, the only answer she chose to give. The formal proceedings concluded by midday. Rougier and Gaspard were placed under guard to await transport to the regional court. The house began to breathe again, though it would take weeks, months, to return to its full rhythm. The east wing bore the scars of fire, its beams blackened, its floor scorched, but it still stood. And the coffer, sealed once more, was placed under new authority, not to be hidden again. By mid-afternoon, the courtyard emptied. The staff returned to their duties. The magistrate's carriage rolled away, and Elise packed. She did so slowly, folding her belongings with the same care she had given the household linens. There wasn't much: a spare dress, a worn pair of gloves, the comb she had brought on the first day, and the linen-wrapped pendant Henri had given her in the corridor that night. She held it for a long moment, fingers tracing the worn engraving on the back. She had not asked about the woman's portrait, had not needed to. It was his mother. It had meant something once. It still did. When she descended the servant's stair, her small bag over one shoulder, the corridor was quiet. The house seemed larger now, as if each corner had expanded in the aftermath of truth. Henri waited by the front door. He was dressed simply, no sash, no emblem, only the faint trace of soot still clinging to the fold of his coat. His hands were bare, his hair still slightly damp from a wash. He watched her approach with the solemnity of a man who had spent too long preparing what he meant to say. "You're leaving." Elise stopped a few feet from him. "I wasn't meant to stay." "You were meant to arrive." The words settled like rain after drought. She said nothing. Henri stepped forward. "You were never a servant, Elise." She looked up at him. "I was, but I refused to remain invisible." He gave a slow, quiet nod. "You never were." She hesitated. The silence between them was not strained, but fragile. "There's a carriage waiting to take you to the village," he said. "But if you choose to stay, I won't stay as someone watched, or controlled, or owed." His mouth twitched, neither a smile nor a frown, just a flicker of something deeper. "No," he said, "you wouldn't." Another silence passed. Then he reached into his coat and drew out something small, wrapped in a piece of cloth, not unlike the one he had given her that night. "I had this restored," he said, "after the fire." She took it and unfolded the cloth. It was the pendant. Polished now, the miniature inside protected behind fresh glass, the chain replaced with one of simple gold. "I thought it was yours," she said. He met her eyes. "It was my mother's, but she would have wanted someone like you to wear it." Elise said nothing. She closed the cloth gently around the pendant and held it to her chest. He watched her. "You changed this house. You changed yourself. That was harder." She almost smiled. "I will rebuild what must be rebuilt," he said. But not in the dark, not in silence. The wind moved through the open door, tugging gently at the hem of her dress. Henri stepped aside. "I won't ask you to stay," he said, "but I will hope." She met his gaze one last time. Then she walked out through the doorway, past the threshold where she had first arrived, her head high, her footsteps steady. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of turned earth and morning ash. The vineyards stretched toward the horizon, golden in the late sun. And behind her, the château stood quiet, changed, but standing. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.